Distinguished viewers, today marks the day General Motors just proved Mark Carney right. As we speak, 1,000 Canadian auto workers are completing their final shifts at the Oshawa plant. Their jobs eliminated not because of market conditions or poor performance, but because Donald Trump's tariff regime has made it profitable for General Motors to abandon Canada. Let that sink in for a moment. This is a company that just announced $10 billion in projected profits for 2026. A company that earned $2.7 billion in 2025, despite claiming tariffs cost them billions. And yet somehow, they cannot afford to keep Canadian workers employed. The cruel mathematics are undeniable. GM posted massive earnings while shipping 700 jobs south to Indiana, all under the shadow of Trump's economic coercion. But here's what mainstream media will not tell you about what happened this week. While General Motors was executing this calculated retreat from Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney was not standing idle. He was building something Trump cannot threaten, cannot tariff, and cannot control. Let us examine the timeline that brought us to this moment. When Trump imposed his auto tariffs last year, threatening 25% levies on vehicles crossing North American borders, he believed he had found the perfect weapon to force manufacturing back to American soil. General Motors responded exactly as he hoped. The company announced it would eliminate Oshawa's third shift, affecting up to 1,200 workers throughout the supply chain, and simultaneously added 250 temporary positions at its Fort Wayne, Indiana facility. The message was unmistakable: build in America or pay the price. The union representing these workers, Unifor, did not mince words in their statement this week. Despite GM posting $10 billion in North American profits, even after losing billions to tariffs, they are shifting jobs to the United States. Consider the audacity of that statement from GM's Chief Financial Officer, Paul Jacobson, during their earnings call just 2 days ago. He praised the Trump administration for what he called smart policy that will increase U.S. auto production, all while Canadian families faced unemployment. This is what transactional chaos looks like in practice. But something remarkable happened on Monday, January 26th, that most analysts missed. Ontario Premier Doug Ford sat down with Mark Carney and Industry Minister Melanie Joly for what the Premier later described as an incredible, productive conversation. They shared pizza together in Etobicoke. They discussed not damage control, but strategic transformation. Ford, who had been publicly critical of Carney's China electric vehicle deal just days earlier, emerged from that meeting with a completely different tone. He called the federal auto strategy great and confirmed Ontario will be part of it. What changed in that room over pizza was not just a political disagreement, it was the crystallization of a fundamental choice facing Canada. Do we continue begging American corporations and American presidents for permission to employ our own citizens, or do we build an economy that cannot be held hostage by whoever occupies the White House? Mark Carney has made his choice abundantly clear. The very next day after that pizza meeting, Carney and Joly announced the creation of a new federal auto task force that includes Ontario. This is not symbolic bureaucracy. This represents the operational framework for what Carney has been building since taking office. Now turn your attention to what this auto strategy actually accomplishes, because the details matter enormously. The task force announced Monday will coordinate federal and provincial efforts on car manufacturing investment, jobs, and crucially, electrification. But coordination is only the visible surface. Beneath that announcement lies a comprehensive restructuring of Canada's automotive sector that deliberately reduces dependence on American market access. Start with the China deal that caused such controversy. Carney negotiated an agreement allowing 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles annually at a 6.1% tariff, down from the 100% surtax Canada had mirrored from American policy. In exchange, China reduced its canola tariffs, providing immediate relief to Canadian farmers who had been suffering under Beijing's retaliatory trade measures. Doug Ford initially called this terrible for Ontario's auto sector. He urged Canadians to boycott Chinese EVs. But here's what Ford understood once Carney explained the full strategy. Those Chinese vehicles are not the threat. The threat is having zero alternative when companies like General Motors decide Canadian workers are expendable. The China agreement creates leverage. When GM threatens a pullout unless Canada matches American subsidies or accepts American trade restrictions, Carney can now point to alternative partnerships. When Trump demands Canada abandon its own industrial policy in exchange for market access, Carney can now build electric vehicle supply chains that bypass American gatekeeping entirely. Consider the specific investments this enables. Chinese companies have expressed interest in establishing production facilities in Canada to serve that 49,000 vehicle quota. These would be real manufacturing jobs with supply chain integration, not just assembly plants shipping parts from overseas. Battery production, particularly, represents an area where Canadian critical mineral resources give us natural advantages that don't depend on American permission. The federal government's commitment to working with provinces through the task force means these investments can move forward with coordinated regulatory approval, land access, and workforce development. Let us examine the timeline Carney is working with, because speed matters here. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement review begins this year. Trump has already threatened new tariffs repeatedly, treating the agreement as leverage for whatever demand strikes him on any given morning. Rather than negotiating from a weakness, begging Trump to preserve market access, while companies like GM use that uncertainty to extract concessions from Canadian workers, Carney is building parallel infrastructure. He met with premiers yesterday for their Council of the Federation gathering, and today is hosting the First Ministers meeting. His message to them was direct. We focus on what we can control. What Canada can control is domestic investment, interprovincial trade barriers that currently fragment our economy, and partnerships with countries that view trade as mutually beneficial, rather than zero-sum coercion. During his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, just over a week ago, Carney told the assembled global leaders to stop invoking the rules-based international order, as though it still functions as advertised. He called the current system what it is, a framework of intensifying great power rivalry, where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as a weapon of coercion. That was not diplomatic rhetoric, that was a prime minister telling automakers and premiers and Canadian workers that he sees exactly what is happening, and he refuses to accept it as inevitable. When Doug Ford emerged from Monday's meeting calling the federal auto strategy great, he was acknowledging this reality. Ontario cannot protect its auto sector by hoping Trump will be reasonable or that GM will be loyal. Ontario can only protect its interests by joining a national strategy that makes Canadian automotive production valuable, regardless of American market access. The Federal Auto Task Force will look at future strategic investments, protect unionized workforce, and ensure trade works for workers rather than against them. According to Industry Minister Joly's statement Monday, those are not abstract promises. Those represent specific mechanisms. Investment tax credits structured to favor domestic content, trade agreements that prioritize Canadian jobs over American corporate profits, workforce protections that prevent companies from playing provinces against each other in a race to the bottom on wages and working conditions. The defenders of the current system will argue that Canada cannot afford to antagonize the United States, that our economy depends too heavily on American market access to risk Trump's wrath with independent action. Let me be very clear about why this argument has it exactly backwards. Canada's economy is suffering precisely because we have been too dependent on American market access. General Motors is not laying off 1,200 workers because Canadian labor is uncompetitive or Canadian facilities are inefficient. The Oshawa plant that builds Chevrolet Silverados is literally the only GM facility that produces both heavy and light-duty versions on the same line. It is a highly skilled, highly productive operation that generates enormous profits for GM. Those workers are losing their jobs because Donald Trump's tariff threats make it marginally cheaper for GM to consolidate production in the United States. And because GM knows Canada has no alternative to offer. The cruel irony that Trump supporters refuse to acknowledge is that his tariff regime is not reshoring American jobs. It is simply redistributing existing North American jobs based on political pressure rather than economic efficiency. GM is still importing parts from Mexico and Canada to its American plants, still paying billions in tariff costs that get passed on to American consumers through higher vehicle prices, and still facing labor shortages in the United States because American workers quite reasonably do not want to work in auto plants for the wages automakers want to pay. Meanwhile, American border cities that depend on Canadian commerce are hemorrhaging revenue as cross-border shopping collapses, and Canadian tourists stop visiting. What Mark Carney understands is that economic sovereignty is not optional in this new era. When the world's largest economy treats trade agreements as suggestions and uses tariffs as political weapons, middle powers like Canada must build resilience through diversification. The Federal Auto Task Force is not about replacing the American market overnight. It is about ensuring that when General Motors makes its next calculation about where to invest, when the next round of customs negotiations begins, when Trump or whoever follows him makes the next tariff threat, Canada has options. We have alternative markets, alternative partnerships, alternative supply chains. We have the capacity to say no when the terms are unacceptable because our workers' livelihoods no longer depend entirely on American goodwill. Today, 1,000 Canadians lost their jobs to Trump's economic coercion. But the infrastructure Carney is building ensures that tomorrow's Canadian workers will not face the same vulnerability. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission.